Hello YouTube, and welcome to this review of what has been the highest requested book on this channel ever since its creation, namely Sun and Steel. If you're a lifter, if you spend any amount of time within fitness culture, you have heard about this book, you have been told that this book is the Bible of the Church of Iron for a good reason, because it is. It's an amazing read, and I don't know a single person that hasn't been changed by this reading. So it's finally time for me to give my opinion on the text. And I'm doing this now because if you are aware, I review philosophy within the Educated Barbarian series, and that series was supposed to continue on with Jung and then Dostoevsky after Nietzsche. But the issue is that I know for a fact that the Jung series is going to be at least 10 hours long, and Dostoevsky as well, because Nietzsche was like 15 hours, which will lead us on to like 2025. So if we have to wait to cover Mishima that long, we'll never actually do it. So I decided to make this book skip in line because many of you couldn't wait. And I couldn't wait either. I really wanted to finally give my thoughts on the book. So I think we're going to do a three-part series on this book, maybe a 3-hour cycle. It's not going to be too long. It will depend entirely on if you like the first episode or not. This is the first episode, and that first episode will be mostly an introduction. The way it's going to be laid out is just like with the rest of the philosophy on this channel. I'm going to offer a structured analysis where I'm going to cover the most important concepts of science still. So again, an introduction to Mishima's philosophy, and that will be divided in themes that you can navigate using the timestamps. And this should really help for those of you who have read Sun and Steel, but struggle to understand it because it is a complex text, and maybe you don't really want to have to read every single Mishima book to help you understand this one, because you're only really interested by the content of this book, which is the one that concerns itself with self-improvement, and that is perfectly fine. This is why I'm making this video, is to help clarify the teachings of Yukio Mishima without, in a sense, taking away from his style, because he was a poet first and foremost, and the poetic quality of his writings must be preserved at all costs. So I will attempt to do that today. Now, when it comes to the author himself, you might know that Mishima was controversial in the current political sphere, or rather paradigm, because he was right-wing, he was reactionary, he was an extremist, etc., etc. He was, in truth, a revolutionary. He had a certain idea of what Japan should be like. He despised modern Japan. He saw it as a country that gave up to the US, and so he wanted it to regain its former glory and, most importantly, its former pride. But that's not the point of today's video. Today's video is not an essay about politics. This will be for later. If you are interested, this book contains Mishima's political ideology, so I'll eventually get to cover it. But whenever it is relevant, whenever one of his metaphors, for example, has something to do with his politics, I will be forced to cover it. I just want to make clear that this episode in particular is about self-improvement. But Mishima's backstory is Mishima. It is who he is. If we ignore it, then we ignore his teachings, because the author and the past of the author and the beliefs of the author make and create what the author puts in his books. Now that this is out of the way, we can start with our first episode. So as always, it's going to be laid back. It's an essay, so I recommend you sit tightly and comfortably and you grab yourself a drink. As per usual, I have my minimalist style cup, which also goes beautifully with my minimalist style t-shirt. All right. So the first thing about Sun and Steel that personally surprised me a lot was that I did not expect it to be what it is. Meaning that I had a certain level of preconceived ideas going in, and I thought that I was going to get an agakure of sort, a treaty about Bushido. In a sense, I was expecting a twin book that would copy the Book of Five Rings by Musashi. And I didn't get that at all. This is not what this book is. So at the start, I was quite disappointed because I felt that this book, like the Vitality, it was too timid. But that was a mistake because the more I read, the more I realized that, yeah, the introspective style of Mishima is not as aggressive and in your face as Musashi. It's not a book of commandments, but that's the beauty of it. Instead, you are taught to learn how to live via means that are not as straightforward as what you would normally expect from self-improvement. Modern self-improvement is a lot of do this, do that, like a 10-step program on how to become a man. Mishima does none of that because Mishima in reality talks about how he became a man, how he constantly strived towards his ideal of manhood, of developing the body of his dreams, and etc. So he really has no time to dedicate to tell you how to do anything. He's just talking about his story, his memory, his childhood, his past, and he's hoping that you might learn from it. And this is explained immediately in the book. So in the first few paragraphs, Mishima details what he calls confidential criticism, which is the nature of this book. This book is technically not an autobiography because within this criticism that he offers of his own person, what Mishima does is that he allows what he calls the night of confession, which is a more subjective approach, an introspective approach to this work of autobiography, where you look at your childhood, you look at your past, and you try to see what your mistakes were and what got you where you are, which tends to be very nostalgic, and it's a style that I really like, with another component that he names the day of criticism. So it's not just looking back, it's also looking back to analyze. And this is a quality that many people lack. Naturally, because when we look back at what we used to do, our mistakes, for example, we are emotionally attached. Naturally, we're talking about ourselves. It is difficult to treat it like a surgeon, to treat it in a fashion that then allows you to become better. But Mishima manages, again, by mixing these two things together. And just for that, this book is special, which is why if you're like me and you start reading it and you feel taken aback because it feels foreign, keep reading. It's perfectly normal to feel like this. It's because you most likely have never read anything like this before. And I'll say it now, I'll say it again at the end of the video. Naturally, I encourage you to read the book. This episode is to help you understand the difficult concepts in the book, but nothing will replace reading the actual book. With Mishima himself, the man that you see on this cover, also came a second aspect that surprised me even more, which is the complete absence of the facade of the samurai. Someone like Musashi, for example, if you read his books, it doesn't feel like you're reading a book by a human. It feels like you're reading a book by a demigod, because he only really gives orders and he only really shows his best side, what he was best at, and his excellence. But it's very tough to connect to that type of person emotionally. Whereas with Mishima, Mishima is not trying to front. He's not trying to paint himself as a hero at all. If anything, most of the time he paints himself as the opposite of the hero, which is why he wanted to develop heroic qualities. And that's a level of vulnerability that I personally find very inspiring, because that's also what I want to attain on this channel. I never want you to think that I'm above you or different or special, because I'm none of these things. I'm just a man who's walking on the path, just like you. And Mishima is one such man as well. He is walking on the path. Or at least he was. And he's telling us the story of that journey. And it's a story that relates to us. It relates to our journey. It's crazy because reading him, a man from Japan, from a culture completely different from my own, I felt a level of kinship that I've rarely felt before reading anyone else. And I think that's the reason why so many people love this book, is because it connects us. It connects us to the author, but it also connects us to one another. And this attempt at vulnerability is made immediately evident from the start because, as I said, when Mishima, and times again my brain wants to say Musashi or Miura because they all start with M's and they're all great men. It's the triple M's, the big M's. But Mishima, when he talks about his memories of childhood, begins from a very lowly position because he did not start the way he became. And that should be obvious, but it's always hard when you look at a great author or a great man to figure out or even be able to picture the fact that there used to be a kid there. As Nietzsche used to say, l'enfant est le père de l'homme. Child is the father of the father, in a sense. And the man you became was birthed by the child you used to be. So starting with Mishima's childhood, in my opinion, is extremely important. And in his childhood, as I said, Mishima was the complete opposite of what he became. He became a very vigorous, vital man who was in pursuit of physical fitness, health, and who was also extremely politically inclined to the point that he essentially attempted a coup, where he attempted to restore the emperor, which failed, sadly for him, and then he committed seppuku because he failed in his mission, and so he decided that his life was over. It's more complicated than that. It's ritualistic death via seppuku to restore one's honor and save one's face, which is something we might discuss later on. But it's just to tell you that you would have never been able to tell that he would become that man if you looked at him as a kid, because he describes himself as a book nerd. A book nerd, a book rat, un rat de bibliothèque. He was extremely cerebral, but he was also a wimp. He was a wimp of a kid. And he uses a beautiful metaphor. I think the strongest suit of Mishima's style is his metaphors and analogies, because they're very poetic, but they also are straight to the point. They make a lot of sense if you spend enough time to understand them. So he describes the physical body as a pillar, and it's a pillar of white wood, so it's extremely extremely precious. And it's the pillar on which every single man lives and on which every single man's vitality and body rests. And when you age, that pillar that used to support the body is devoured by ants. It slowly withers away, and that is nature. That is perfectly normal. But for him, even as a kid, the pillar was already withered away because it appeared too late. He was born without a backbone, and the day he discovered that backbone, he realized that it was already half broken because he did not know how to use it. And in his own words, it was because that backbone was wasted by woods. So because he was so cerebral and so wood inclined, whenever his physical body became apparent to him and the gift of physicality became apparent, it was already too late. It was wasted on him because he had a complete inability to actually tap into that physicality because he constantly tried to intellectualize it and use words to approach the physical body. And it's something that I can relate to because I was exactly like this. I was a very nerdy kid, and maybe Mishima was like that too. My fault, my sin was that I was told early on that I was a smart kid, and I latched onto that. And what I did naturally also is that people who possess the opposite trait, physicality, I looked down upon them because I saw them as baboons, as monkeys. I thought to myself, oh, look at these idiots using the body when I, the superior one, used the brain. And naturally, there was envy in this too. I hated these kids because they had something I didn't have, and they were also very popular. But this is something that is very common with humans. We tend to double down on our own flaws and vulnerabilities by calling them strengths. But if you do that long enough, you get to a point where, just like with Mishima, the time where you finally realize the importance of what you miss, it's already too late because you can no longer make that thing your own. And so he became what I call a boy without a body. So he had a physical body, of course he's not a ghost, but he had no use for it, and worse than that, he had a level of hatred for that thing that carried all of the benefits that he was looking for. Because he was intelligent. So he understood that there was virtue and value in the body, but he was completely unable to understand it because he was trying to understand the body via words. And the issue is that reality, the reality of the body, physical existence as a whole, cannot be understood only with words. It has to be tasted with the organ that was developed to taste it, meaning the body. It's the body that possesses the senses that allows you to interact with reality. But if you don't realize that soon enough, you develop a pathology of sort, a pathology of the senses, Well, you are essentially missing one, and that missing sense is the body in itself. So as Mishima puts it, words are a medium that reduces reality to abstraction for transmission to our reason. And in their power to corrode reality, inevitably lurks the danger that the words themselves will be corroded too. So now you're left with a conundrum. You are a boy without a body. You cannot understand reality with the body. So you're left with words. But what do words do? Well, they allow you to put meaning, to make sense of reality by actually translating it into the language that you speak, the language of words. But by doing that, you also transform that reality. Because when you call something a book, for example, this is not a book. Book is the word I use to refer to that item in my hand. But by calling it a book, I'm reducing its nature. I'm corroding its nature down to what I call a book. So I'm damaging the item. And naturally, you also understand that it's what I'm doing to Mishima's philosophy too. By me talking to you about that book, I'm digesting the meaning and I'm spitting it back like a mama bird feeding a baby bird. So what you're getting is a corroded version of that book. The only way for you to actually access the book in its purest essence is to read it, and even then, one could argue that you will still not get close to the true essence of the book and the philosophy, because the only person who can do that is Mishima. And even then, he himself is not truly there because he had to use words. He had to put words in the book to describe the philosophy. So philosophy in its purest sense would exist without words, but it would not be accessible. That is a bit of a tangent, but this is a tangent that's important because this is an important concept in Mishima's work. This idea that words and language are vital to be able to understand reality and to discuss it, but also that they're dangerous because in their corroding action, yes, they transform, yes, they make available, but they also destroy. So it's like a stomach. And this is a metaphor that Mishima uses. Language is like a stomach. Now, what happens if the stomach is empty? Well, if it is empty, if you don't have any material items in the stomach, what happens is that it starts to digest itself. So, a boy without a body like Mishima, when he attempted to understand the body, had nothing to digest. So he was digesting himself. He was starting to enter a cycle where he was pretty much guaranteeing that he would never be able to understand what a physical body actually means. But he didn't want to let go of that because Mishima from a young age wanted to be an author. And to be an author, one has to become extremely familiar and become acquainted with words. So he had to accept this coercive part. He couldn't do without it. But he also understood that this coercive part, this language that he was so fond of, would never allow him to understand the physical body and physical existence. So he had to find an activity that was completely disconnected with words that would be purely physical. And actually, you understand that this is where he discovered bodybuilding. This is where he discovered physical fitness, because physical fitness can be done without any words. It's something that can be done purely with the body. You need a brain, in a sense, to pilot the body, but you don't need to put words or to use language to approach the action of lifting iron, for example, which is something that many people should actually take to heart, because when you look at how intellectualized fitness has become, and I might be a culprit in this big game because I talk about programming all the time, you also understand that boys without bodies exist in this sphere and that they themselves are victim of the corroding and corrosive nature of words, and that they, unlike Mishima, might never be able to actually exist above it because the way and the mean in which they engage with the activity, namely lifting, that would free them from words and from the prison that is language, is already polluted by language because that's how they get acquainted with it. And if you are aware, or if you have followed any of my videos about Greek philosophy, you see that there is a strong parallel here between what the Greeks believed the mind and body dualism represented and what Mishima is still telling us here. Because this is Mishima telling us that yes, there is a disparity, there is a dualism and a separation between the physical body and language and the intellect, right? Well, it's not as simple as this. Because Mishima also believed in the concept of the complete man. And for him, the reason why the samurai was such a figure worthy of adoration and respect was because the samurai was the complete man. He was not limited to his function. The samurai was not a bodyguard and he was not a foot soldier. The samurai was a heart and it was a spirituality. If you remove that from the samurai, he's no longer a samurai, he's something else. So Mishima's goal with this alliance of the action without language and the language without action, so being an author but also being a lifter, was to be both physically competent and accomplished, but also educated and intellectually capable. And I think this is a goal that everyone should shoot for. I think this makes a lot of sense, and there is absolutely no point in maxing out the stats on one side and not the other. So you really do not want to be a boy without a body, because some people are boys without bodies by happenstance. It's not really their fault, like Mishima. Some people, they choose to. It's like something they decide. They take pride, they're proud of it. They derive pride in not being physical. Like it makes them smarter. It doesn't make you smarter, it makes you incomplete. But naturally, as always, we have a tendency to overvaluate the things that we possess because we possess them, it makes us feel good. And we tend to make fun of things that we don't possess because it makes us feel bad that we do not have these things. So it's best for us to tell ourselves that these things actually don't matter at all. But in this attempt, again, at reconciling the two together, the body and the spirit, he also, Mishima, deconstructs this mind-body dualism. Because if we go back to the notion of the stomach, and we think about it, what exactly is the stomach? Well, the stomach is this thing that has the ability to digest. But what does it digest? Well, it will digest reality. So, if it doesn't ingest anything, if it's just an organ, like the brain, for example, because there's this parallel between the brain and the stomach. So if you just have a stomach or just have a brain, but it never actually gets to interact with reality, so the physical ability to interact with the world, then there's nothing to digest. So you end up digesting yourself, or you end up with thoughts that are just thoughts of thoughts. They're not actually linked with reality. So it doesn't make much sense, it's not very efficient, it's actually a pathology. But then, the vice versa also exists. What if you have plenty of interactions with reality, but no digestive ability? Because you lack a brain, you lack a stomach. Well then, you're not a boy without a body, you're a boy without a brain. And that's not much better. The two are abominations, because the two contradict one another. Right? The stomach and the brain exist to digest things. So the two functions need to come together. But for him, as we said, from his experience, this was not possible from the start because he had a predisposition for woods. So he was naturally gifted for it, and he had convinced himself that he was devoid of the flesh. Because outside of the realm of woods, nothing could be understood for him. If he couldn't put words on things, then the things didn't exist to him. But the second he used words to describe things, then they would corrode. So once again, conundrum. This is a paradox, and he was left at a dead end. But we saw just minutes ago that he also had this notion and instinct of seeking out an activity that would not require language, and that was physical fitness. So what is the problem here? Why are we still stuck here? Well, it was because he was perfectly aware of the coercive nature of language, and so he avoided describing the reality that he wanted to accomplish, the reality of the physical body, because it was afraid it would melt, but at the same time, he could not, absolutely not, understand or apprehend a reality that would not be pre-digested by words, again, because of his tendency to constantly intellectualize things. So he was stuck, and he had developed what he called a stubborn refusal to perceive the body. And the reason for that inability is actually quite silly and simple, but also the type of enigma and riddle that would have really confused young Mishima, because when he was trying to apprehend and understand what the body was, he was looking for it in existence. So he was expecting to find something tangible there, something he could hold and describe with words. But the issue is that, and this is something that he realized later, that the body is a form of existence that rejects existence. So if you desperately look for it within existence, well, you'll spend the rest of your life looking and you'll never actually find it. And I know that this might sound a bit cryptic, but it's actually very easy to understand. So to give you an example, it would be like trying to understand the concept of mindfulness by describing its content. So if someone asks you, hey, what is mindfulness? And they expected you to describe what goes on in your mind as you experience mindfulness. Or if this person uses that definition of the term, they will never be able themselves to experience mindfulness, because whenever they try to enter that state, they'll be thinking, they'll be looking, they'll be browsing their brain and thoughts to find mindfulness. But if you have experienced that feeling, you know that mindfulness is the absence of content. It's the empty mind. It's the gazing into the void. That is what describes the concept. So by looking for its existence within the context of content, well, you can never find it because its nature is the absence of content. Just like the nature of the body is the absence of existence that therefore cannot be found within existence. But because Mishima was dead set on being able to experience the body for what it is, and he couldn't access it via that path, well, what he did is that he took a different path. And that path should be obvious to you at this point. It was the path of language. But as we saw, you cannot describe the body via language because you corrode its meaning. So what is left for him to do? Well, what he did instead is he invented something new. He invented his own ideal hypothetical physical existence, one that did not actually correlate with the natural existence of the body, but it really didn't matter because what needed to happen for him at that point was to be able to settle on that idea. And later on in life, and this is something I'll describe as well, he discovered what the body was. But once he discovered it, he was left with the two concepts: the true natural concept of the body, that is experienced outside of existence, and the one that he created for himself. And this is where we finally get to Mishima's approach to self-improvement, because it is found in what I call, and what he calls in reality, a language of the body. It is by developing this language of the body that Mishima's quest for the self began, and where he found his answer, because the answer was both simple and evident, and he presents it as follows. As I pondered the nature of that I was driven to the conclusion that the I in question corresponded precisely with the physical space that I occupied. And this, it sounds hyper simplistic, and maybe it's 20 minutes in, 30 minutes in, and you're going to tell yourself, okay, did you just make me meander through all of this philosophical bullshit just to announce me that the body is what occupies space? Thank you, Sherlock, I knew that. Like, that's the obvious answer. Well, actually, it's not that obvious at all, because it completely contradicts the mindless approach to the body that we described previously, because something that occupies space is something that exists. So it contradicts the notion that the body is existence without existence. It's a completely new definition, and one that is incredibly important, because once you reject that mindless body, then you become able to interact with the body and to modify it at will. The body is no longer something that just happens, it becomes a canvas. And it's a canvas that you get to paint on. And that's exactly what Mishima created with his absurd obsession with words and language, his constant attempt at intellectualizing everything. He had built an opportunity, that of creating a custom-made existence where the bodily vessel that we all have would now possess characteristics of his own choosing, namely what he describes as taciturnity and beauty of form. So now he no longer is the victim of fate or the subject of his own body. He no longer is someone by default. He's no longer a default character. He has turned himself into a custom character. And the reason why I insisted so much on this aspect of Mishima's philosophy is because you would be extremely surprised to learn that many people never do that work. What I just described to you is a rarity. If you think, duh, it makes sense, it's because you're into physical fitness. You're most likely into bodybuilding. So you do these things almost naturally. But you fail to realize that you are the minority in that. The majority of the population does not do that. You, at some point, rejected the idea of the body as a mere material anchor for the spirit and have decided instead to turn it into a work of art that could best reflect your personality, your character, your spirit, your aspirations, and your ideals. So now you're no longer just someone who is a passenger of their body. Now you become the shipwright of the body. You become the builder and the driver, the two at the same time, which is something that is extremely special and must be highlighted. I really think it's important. There is this trend and this wave of fucking fake humbleness within fitness spheres where we're supposed to tell ourselves, oh, we're not that much better than average people. Bullshit. Bullshit. We are artists and we have taken the reins of an existence and a bodily existence that the average person doesn't even understand. They're even afraid of touching the concept. They're perfectly okay with just existing as is. And that is something that Mishima rejected, and it's something that you also rejected. So why not take pride in that? There's work that went into it. You were certainly never born like this. You had to put in effort. And so every effort must be something that eventually pays off, either in the form of accomplishments, physical accomplishments, with a muscular body, for example, but also an elevated spirit, because you know that you did things that other people were incapable of doing. And by doing that, you're also inscribing yourself in a very old tradition, because this, what Mishima described, it's not new. He didn't invent that. He described it in terms that I've never seen before, but what he described is essentially self-improvement, something that the ancient Greeks were also preaching. And what is the goal of self-improvement? Well, it's to become a better person, yes, but it's also to shoot for an ideal. And what is the ideal of all ideals? Well, it is the pursuit of beauty, the pursuit of formal beauty. If you bodybuild, sure, you're going towards your own goal, you're going towards your own physique that you like, but in that also exists the notion of beauty as this universal transcendental value that we are all trying to access. We don't quite know what it is, but we know it's there, and we know, more importantly, that it's worthy, meaning that it's something that must be pursued, and also something that must be protected. The concept of beauty must be protected. And if you bodybuild, you're doing both. You are a living billboard for beauty, for the pursuit of it and the effort and the cost of it, but you are also a guardian of that beauty in the world, because I think that the world would be a sad place without beauty. So the fact that you are willing to fight for it and you advertise it with your very existence, that is quite exceptional indeed. And to him, this is why it must be, the language that he described, must be regarded as the embodiment of the pursuit, namely the attempt of trying to create an ideal body that cannot be described by words and is therefore free from corrosion because it is free from the corrupting nature and action of language. So in a sense, he was trying to embody the very notion of beauty. And if you've paid attention, you see that there's a contradiction here. Because how can we talk about a language of the body if the language of the body's aim is to create something that cannot be described? But that is the paradoxical nature of beauty itself. Beauty itself is akin to the body, its existence without existence. It exists, but at the same time, it doesn't. You only really see beauty when it's embodied by something, a woman, a statue, a body, a painting. But outside of that, the concept in itself, it's not real, it's not tangible. And if you were right now to try and describe to me what beauty is using language, the only thing you would do is you would savage that concept. You would corrode and erode that concept because it's almost impossible to describe it with terms but the second you see it, you know it for what it is. When you see something beautiful, you say to yourself, wow, this is beauty. And you do not need to intellectualize it. If you attempted, you would find that the only thing you would do again is to damage that realization. It's to damage the quality of beauty that you find in the item. And in that sense, I find that Mishima was a visionary because if you look at the postmodern attempts at describing beauty, for example, you will find that times and times again, the conclusion that it leads to is the idea that there's no such thing as beauty. Because naturally, if you deconstruct concepts, well, eventually you are left with the parts and there is no concept anymore. So it's easy to tell yourself, well, there was no concept to start with. All of this was just a creation of language, and you would be absolutely correct. But the language itself was seeking to describe something in reality, something that did not need language to exist. And when you see that beauty in the world, when you attempt to make that beauty come alive, then you realize that, yes, this is a concept that transcends human language. It did not need human language to exist. We, with our eyes and our perception, decide this is beautiful and this is not. But the fact that we find certain things beautiful, that cannot be negotiated with, and it shouldn't be, because any attempt to has a tendency to destroy beauty itself. And this might sound a bit hypocritical coming from me, because I'm all for deconstructing. I absolutely love spending a lot of time looking at concepts, breaking them down to see if they're actually useful, trying to find their origin. It's the basis of Nietzschean philosophy in reality. But just because an approach is pertinent sometimes does not mean it is pertinent all the time. I also believe that there are aspects of human existence, of human sentimentalism, that should be left untouched, because when we touch it, we have a tendency to just corrupt them entirely. But what of physical development? Because for now, we've spoken about a lot of interesting philosophical concepts, but we have yet to retouch the heart of Sun and Steel, and the reason why so many of you wanted me to talk about the book, which is the physique, the body, lifting weights, right? Well, when does that happen? Where does that occur? Well, as we see with Mishima's life, it only came much, much later, because at the start, as I said, he developed the language of the body. But the actual body itself and what he calls the language of the flesh, that came later. So we are dealing with a very interesting case study here. He was entirely fluent in the language of the body, so the pursuit of physical beauty and the ideal, without ever having done anything with his body. And usually for the vast majority of people, it's the other way around. You start learning the language of the flesh, you become physically active, and if you have a brain, most likely at some point you start to intellectualize the practice and you come up with a language of the body. But he did that in the wrong order. He started with the brain and then he developed the muscles around the brain. And for him, what that trigger, that moment where he realized that it was not enough to just speak the language of the body, but also to feel the language of the flesh, was a particular moment where young men would parade around the town and they would carry the shrines on their shoulders. And Mishima was fascinated by the fact that he could not understand what these young men were feeling at that time, which is peculiar because he was very intelligent. And intelligence is also the ability to feel empathy towards people, but also to comprehend experiences that you've never experienced yourself. And yet he was incapable here. There was a blockade. There was a language barrier that made it impossible for him to understand why he was seeing such ecstasy on these faces, why their eyes shined with such passion. It was a mystery. And him being curious, which is also a trait of intelligence, he wanted to be able to solve that mystery. And he did not manage to do that by writing books, by spending hours pondering. All of that was completely useless because, again, all of that was an attempt to understand the body via language. Instead, what made things click is quite obvious. I'm certain that you are going to agree with me. It was simply to do the thing. It was simply for him one day to also carry one of these shrines around. And the second he did that, the knowledge of that feeling that he saw on this boy's face came rushing to him. Suddenly he understood. He understood the experience that no language of the body could possibly describe. And this also applies to lifting. I don't know if you have the memory of the first time you saw someone lift weights before you lifted weights. I do, and I know that I couldn't understand what I saw, and so I made fun of it, because to me it was stupid. Why are you lifting a piece of iron from point A to point B? There's not even a point, there's no function, it's stupid, it makes no sense. Well, I was entirely ignorant, because the activity of lifting itself is just like the activity of carrying the shrine. For the person who's never done it, it cannot make sense, it is obscure. The answer to this double riddle of what makes it fun, why is it worth it, and what do the eyes see is two and the same. And the answer is nothing and nothing. What makes lifting fun? You can try and put words on it, just like you can try to describe to me what beauty is, but you'll see that it is a far removed description from what you actually felt when you lift, because it's undescribable, and better than that, it does not need to be described to be fun. And the second thing with the eyes, what do your eyes see when you lift? Great question. I know what my eyes see. Nothing. I don't see the mirror, I don't see my reflection, I don't see the wall, I don't see the light, I don't see the people. I'm in a different world. I'm in a different universe when I lift weight. Just like those young boys who carried the shrine. They did not pay attention to their surroundings because they were completely absorbed by the activity. And this is what makes both of these things so special. It's that they exist in themselves and they exist for themselves. And that's an aspect of our sport that I think is underrated. Meaning that it makes existence tolerable even just for a moment. For a moment, you don't really have issues or problems anymore, and you're not even really alive anymore. You exist solely to do the action that you've assigned yourself. So even your eyes, what do the eyes see? What a weird question. It's enough that they see. It's enough that they function during the action of lifting, because that's all they're really asked to do. So, if you remember, we spoke about this idea that the body is existence without existence. That's what I just described. When you're lifting weights, when you're carrying a shrine, your body ceases to exist because it's doing what a body is supposed to do, which is move. That is the action of the body that makes the body. That's not an act of existence, it's the opposite. It's an act of non-existence. And here is the quote of this realization I want to share because it's so beautifully written. In their eyes, there was no vision, only the reflection of the blue and absolute skies of autumn. Those blue skies were unusual skies, such as I might never see again in my life. One moment strung up high aloft, the next plunged to the depths, constantly shifting, a strange compound of lucidity and madness. And this description is mystical in a sense, because we're talking about boys carrying shrines. What is so special about it? Well, it's the ritualistic aspect that is special. And once again, refer back to what I said about beauty. What makes things beautiful is that we find them beautiful. What makes things sacred? It's that we have decided that they're sacred. Does it mean that outside of humans there is no such thing as sacred? That the concept of sacred of beauty relies on us, on the existence of humans on the planet? No. It's just that we have our own form of it. And it's something that Mishima realized in that moment when he saw the boys carrying the shrine. It is the fact that these boys believed this moment to be special and ritual that made it ritual. It is the fact that you believe that lifting is special and important in your life that makes it important. So in a sense, humans have this special power of blowing sense and creating meaning where there is none. We create beauty and we create sacred. So the fact that we have now gone to a point, at least in the realm of philosophy, where the trend is to try and deconstruct these things is completely backwards, because we're turning our back on our special gift, on the one thing that made us special, the fact that we are able to build. Any brute, any animal, any semblance of cretin is able to destroy. But the action of creating sacred and creating beauty, that is reserved for artists and that is reserved for people who are exceptional, which Mishima would say are just humans. Because there is a component, and I'm getting far here, but I mean, it's a philosophical video, fuck it. there's a component of Mishima's philosophy that concerns itself with the ordinary. And we'll get back to that because we're going to talk about extraordinary people later in the video. But I think that Mishima would tell you that ordinary people are those who are able to see the sacred and see beauty. And he would consider that those who are unable to do that or who refuse to do that are the weird ones. They should be seen as the abnormal ones, and yet it seems to be that in this day and age, it's the other way around. A different discussion altogether, and something that we might talk about later on. Now, after this discussion of the ritualistic aspect of physical activity, we must also question who is being worshipped here. Because that's the point of a religious ritual. Something somewhere needs to be worshipped. Well, when it's the shrines being carried, it's a god. So it's a kami, for example. It's a spirit of the forest or the spirit of the river. But when it comes to physical fitness, what god? What god do you worship? Some of you might worship Odin. You might even worship Jesus, or you might worship Allah when you lift weights, and that is perfectly fine. But I think that for the majority of people, the god that you worship is yourself. You worship the godhood that resides in your body. And some people point that out and say, well, that's narcissistic and vain. Why would it be? It's not you thinking you're a god, it's you feeding the tiny spark of divinity that is in you. Every human was bestowed with that spark. And that is true whether you believe in God or not. Whether you believe in God or not, you are special because you are human. And whether that spark was bestowed upon you by God or nature or aliens really doesn't fucking matter. What matters is that it's there. And a way to make that spark shine and to make that spark grow in you, to grow that godhood, is to use your special power of pursuing beauty, of growing beauty. And how do we do that as lifters? By lifting weights, by sculpting the body. And this is something that I find especially beautiful because if you think about it, that's one aspect of humanity that makes us all equal. Because we all possess that spark of godhood and we all possess the ability to work on it and to develop it. And I'm not going to cite it because it's a bit complex. I think the video is complex enough as is. But there's an entire portion where Mishima talks about the alchemy of that spark. And he essentially creates an equation where he proves that in the face of physical exertion, all men are equal. And because all men are equal, we're all the same. We're all brothers. We're all together. The skies in the eyes of the young men that carried the shrine was the same regardless of their personal predisposition, of their culture, of their background, of their race, of their age. It did not matter. In that instant, they were united by something almost stronger than blood, and that something was steel. And it's something that I've tried to convey very poorly, and Mishima did it better than me, but the ritual exertion of training is an experience that unites us all. Because even if we train for different goals and different purposes, we all know what training feels like and we all love it dearly. And because of that, we are bound together in brotherhood. Or, as Mishima puts it, it is a blessing that the sun and the steel has conferred on us. However, the key part and aspect of that blessing is that it has to be earned. So even though we're all equal in the fact that we all received it, not every single man goes on and goes out to do something with it. So paradoxically, this factor of equality also creates distance between men. Distance between those who choose to use it, who choose to actually turn that spark into beauty, and those who simply don't. And that distinction, that distance, is something that I refer to as the aristocracy of the body. According to Mishima, the action of physical exertion gives birth to what he calls the tragic, namely, the moment when the perfectly average sensibility momentarily takes unto itself a privileged nobility that keeps others at a distance. And that moment is what I described previously, where you make the decision of working on that spark, of using your special gift. A gift that, once again, we all possess. It's not a question of you have it or you don't, we all have it. Then some of us decide to do something with it. And when we do, we become temporary aristocrats in a sense. And this is extremely interesting because note here that Mishima is not telling you that aristocracy is born and birthed by blood. It's not blood that creates it. It's the choice that we're all able to make. So the only thing required here is spirit. And the only difference in spirit between those who transcend their average sensibility, we're all average at the start, it's a choice to decide not to be average, and those who end up reaching that privileged nobility is nothing, again, but a choice. It's nothing but the decision to undergo physical exertion. And naturally, your answer to that would be, well, if it's that easy, then how do you explain again that so many people remain average? And to that, I would tell you that it actually isn't that easy. Effort is something that many people dislike deeply. The vast majority of people do not like lifting weights, they don't like going to the gym, they don't like being sweaty or being out of breath. You are the weird one. You are, in a sense, a form of aristocrat. I'm not afraid to say it. You are a form of physical elite because you're literally fitter than 99% of the population. And the reason why wasn't because you were born fitter with better genetics. It's because one day you've decided to start lifting weights and you've decided to start training seriously. And the interesting thing about that quality that you developed is that not only did you not inherit it, but you're not going to keep it. Meaning that it's not something that you got one day, like a status, a social status, and then it's done and you can rest on your laurels. No, you have to work on it every single day because understand and realize that this privileged nobility is like, how can I best describe it? It's like a buff in a video game and it gives you an attack boost. But that attack boost is going to go away eventually until you take another boost. It's the same with lifting. If you stop lifting, you're going to lose everything you've built. So it's a constant effort towards you staying at the top of your game. That is what is required for you to stay nobility. So there is nothing decadent, there is nothing unjust about this privilege. It's a privilege that you pay with your own blood and with your own sweat every single day. And this is why I call it an aristocracy of the body, because I think it's the best way to describe it. And Mishima makes a clear distinction between this type of privilege that I just described, which is earned entirely via effort that you did not inherit and you cannot pass down, and the special type of sensibility which vaunts its own special claims. So this one applies to a multitude of personality types in modern society. But I think the one that is the most interesting to discuss are those types who understand that there is such a thing as a special status that can be earned via effort, but who don't really want to put in the effort. So what they do instead is they will create a special status of their own that you'll notice, surprisingly, never takes them any effort whatsoever. It just takes for them to claim it. And then they will try to use that to get other people to treat them as if they were special, which usually doesn't work because we have a tendency to only respect effort and heroes. And the focus on heroism is big in Mishima's work, but the hero in the Mishima canon is one who works for it. It's not someone who was born a hero. So the hero is respected because his actions are respectable and because people realize that this person, because they represent a certain set of values, must be upheld as a standard for everyone to live after because it would be for the benefit of society. Whereas those fake heroes that refuse to put in the work but still want to receive the treatment that the hero does are doing the exact opposite. Because if everyone did this, society would devolve into mediocrity. So as a guideline of sorts, if you have to ask people to view you as special, then you're not special because special people don't need to remind you that they're special. And if you have to ask people to treat you as their equal, then you're not their equal either. And I know it's a tough pill to swallow because we have bought into the idea that equality is a given, it's a human right, and you should be able to just say, I'm your equal to someone else to become that. But again, this is the difference between language and reality. With language, this makes a lot of sense. With reality, we know that it makes no sense because if, let's say, crazy word, let's say you go up to someone who is your superior, clearly, and you say, I'm your equal. Either they say no, because no, just no, you're not their equal, or they say yes. And if they say yes, do you become their equal? No, maybe they're just going to say that to placate you or because they're nice, but you're still nothing. And I think that this is something that Mishima understood that this culture of the vapid heroism, the vapid and empty bravery was going to get big because people get more and more passive in their life. But just because humans become passive does not mean that they suddenly become able to do away with the necessity to feel special. So now we have an entire generation of people who want to feel special but don't want to do anything to be special, so they start inventing reasons that make them special, and for anyone with a semblance of sense, these people appear very weird. It's super strange to be surrounded by these types. Now, once again, it's a discussion that is not really in line with the book in itself, but he talks about it, so why not? And I found it extremely interesting that he clearly himself made that distinction. Also because it connects back to what we said previously about this causative nature of language, because as I said, what these people do is they're attempting to use language to replicate the benefits that a body would afford. So they're trying to buy the status of the body, they're trying to buy their spark, a shinier spark, by claiming to have a shinier spark. But it doesn't function like this. We are all gifted with the spark, and those of us who decide to become nobility work on that spark. And that spark can be the body, it can be your talent as a painter, it can be a singer, it doesn't matter. Excellence comes in many forms. But Mishima perceived that this attempt at bargaining with excellence with language was going to be the downfall of excellence. And he warned that the privileged nobility must find its basis strictly in a form of physical courage. So in a sense, it's a blatant attempt at gatekeeping these people by saying, okay, you want to be special? Here, be actually brave, be courageous with the body. Why? Because if you put your body on the line for something, now there is a risk involved. So if you really want to be special, you have to take risks. Those that do not want to take risks get filtered. The cowards and the wimps who are unwilling to risk their skin are now unable to reach that mythical, heroic stature. And some might say that this is mean-spirited, but you have to realize and remember that Mishima was one such type. He used to be timid, he used to be weak and a wimp. And he realized that it was these characteristics as a boy that prevented him from reaching what he wanted. So when he sees people with the same characteristics, boys without bodies, for example, who attempt to do the same thing he does, he sees the mistake and he tries to correct them. Because he understands that the timid, the weak-minded, inherit nothing. They are victims of their fate times and times again. Those who are able to supersede their fate and who take up the reins of their own destiny are the ones we described previously who become the shipwrights of their own bodies. But as we saw, if you start up with language, and you invest all your points in that, it becomes extremely tough to transition outside of it later because you'll have a tendency to try to approach the body with what you know, which is the language. Or again, as Mishima puts it, he who dabbles in words can create tragedy, but he cannot participate in it. So there is a big difference between having the ability to understand this moment where, again, the average sensibility transcends itself and becomes privileged, and the power to actually do that thing with your own body. The two are entirely different. It's like, it's very easy for me to describe the sea, but I would be entirely incapable of creating the sea from scratch. That is naturally a bit of an over-exaggeration, but not that much. I think that the divide and the abyss between the two is just as marked and just as consequential. And because that divide is so big, this also means that the distance between those who stand on that one first side and those who made the jump is extremely big. And you might have noticed that as well. When you start taking responsibility for your own body and you start to better yourself physically, you separate yourself from the rest of the crowd, from the rest of the group, from those out there who only suffer their bodies as victims and have never taken the decision to work on that spark. And as I said previously, this distance is natural. It is there. Don't let people tell you it doesn't exist. It actually does exist. And the proof that it exists is because it makes these people bitter. They're on the other side, they perceive that their side is the worst side, but they will always try to make fun of you for being on that other side. If you're a lifter, you have ran into people who try to belittle you for your passion, try to paint you as an idiot because of your passion. And all of that, if you had actually paid attention, you would realize was just a big attempt at making themselves feel better. They feel angry because they perceive you as being better than them. And you know, there's that saying that goes, if everything is super or everyone is special, then no one is. That is true, but the opposite is also true. Is if everyone is mediocre, then no one is. So if you have a group of people who are all mediocre, they never have to face that mediocrity because they're all the same. But if one of them in the group separates itself and becomes excellent, now there's a point of comparison. Now these people here don't have a choice. They have to accept that the guy on the other side is the guy who is above. He is the superior, and they hate it. They will do whatever they can to kill that guy or turn that guy back into what he used to be. And you could say, well, this is horrible. The only thing they're hurting is themselves by doing that. Yes, absolutely. But try to explain that to these people. If, as a content creator, I can tell you one thing. The thing that pisses mediocre people the most is when you remind them of their mediocrity. Even if you do it in an attempt to wake them up so as to make them excellent, doesn't matter. They will cling onto that mediocrity because it's comfortable, it's a safe space. And you become the enemy in their eyes, you become the asshole because you are forcing them to regard that comfort zone for what it is, which is their constant, repeating and reoccurring mediocrity. And if this all sounds highly Nietzschean to you, it's because it is, and it's not my fault. I'm not the one injecting that knowledge and that meaning into the writings of Mishima. If you read Sun and Steel, you know that it's Nietzschean. There's no way to describe it other than that. He is describing the birth of the Übermensch in his own words, and it's not the same exact characteristics or the same qualities. But listen to this, for example. According to Mishima, excellence is born when the average sensibility, endowed with a given physical strength, encounters that type of privileged moment especially designed for it. Tragedy calls for an anti-tragic vitality and ignorance, and above all, for a certain inappropriateness. That could have been from Nietzsche. It could be a quote directly from Nietzsche. And what connects the two authors as well is this hyper-focus on Dionysian energy. Dionysian energy, which is the essence of chaos, that opposes the essence of order, which is the Apollonian energy. Apollonian energy, which we tend to have an overabundance of. Stoic philosophy, for example, mostly concerns itself with Apollonian energy. But the issue is that the Apollonian, and I've said that word 4 times now, is supposed to work to counterbalance an excess of chaos in the self. But if you're a modern man, you've been domesticated to the point that you have almost no chaotic energy at all. You have no spirit of rebellion. So there is no point in restricting the little that you already have, which is why authors like Mishima and Nietzsche are so interesting, because they are trying to drag us back into our roots, into this vitality, sadly, that we are missing, that is lacking in our existence. Because naturally, that spark of divinity I was talking about is made up of that. It's made up of that chaos. And from that chaos is birthed something beautiful. But you need to be able to apprehend and accept the chaos before it gives birth to order. And that theme was omnipresent in Greek mythology. If you look, for example, at the entire story of Zeus fighting the Titans, all of this is that. It's this constant, tumultuous propagation of chaos that eventually stabilizes into order, then leads back into chaos, etc., etc. And it perfectly mimics also what physical activity is. Because while the object that bodybuilding creates is aesthetic and is beautiful and is balanced, the action that led to that harmony was anything but that. Because lifting weights is aggression, it's abandonment, it is the action of sculpting the statue. And there is always in that a touch of madness. You cannot create beauty if you do not have that ability to tap into that chaotic part of your brain, into that chaotic energy. And that's another paradox that Mishima is revealing for us here. Beauty, as we see it, is a concept that seems entirely linked with Apollonian energy, right? What is beautiful is ordered, it's sculpted, it's balanced. But the action, the transformation and evolution that led to that balance and what we call beauty was the exact opposite of it. And if it wasn't its opposite, then it would have never been able to give birth to what it actually is. And this relationship between chaos and order also applies to sex. If you read Mishima, you know that there's a strong focus on eroticism. Not in this book in particular, but in the rest of his book. And it is best explained by the fact that to him, sexual energy is another great example of Dionysian impulse, because the action itself of sexual intercourse is chaos. What results from it, the child, is perfect. It is nature in its purest form. It is the most beautiful thing in existence. But the act that led to it, sex is chaotic. It's like a storm. It's passions combined that give birth to life. And the same goes for lifting. And they also have this thing in common, that it's impossible to have knowledge of the thing without actually experiencing the thing. And as Mishima puts it, the exercise of the muscles elucidated the mysteries that Woods had made. It was similar to the process of acquiring erotic knowledge. Little by little, I began to understand the feeling behind existence and action. And this is something, just like when I told you previously to try and remember what your perception of lifting was before you lifted, try to do the same thing about sex. Do you remember what sex was to you before you had sex? I know that for me, before that, I had a vague idea of what it was supposed to be, and I had watched porn, so I saw with my own two eyes what it was supposed to look like. And yet, when I had sex, I was blown away, because the experience of the existence was entirely different to what I, with my brain, had concocted. My ability to use language to assign meaning to that action was completely inaccurate. And this applies to any other form of knowledge. Until you've put it into action, you do not know that thing. You could be something that has read every single biological treaty about sexual intercourse between humans. You could have watched every single porn movie in existence, but your knowledge of sexuality would still be incomplete. On the flip side, someone who knows nothing about the topic at all and who has sex one time will be immediately injected with the knowledge of the thing. Suddenly you understand it. So it's not just true for sex. It applies to existence as a whole. To participate in the tragedy of all beings, you don't have a choice. You have to partake in it. And this is once again something quite obvious, I'm certain, for you watching me. But understand that many people don't do that. Many people do not play the game of existence. Many people refrain from experiencing as much as they can from timidity, from fear, or because they have bought into the idea that it is possible to apprehend this knowledge via language. And they might even have started lying to themselves, thinking of themselves as smart or educated. But the truth is that they are empty. They are full of empty words, and these empty words have no value because they're not actually connected with reality. And because Mishima was sensing that this was the path he was going down to, he began training. That was his antidote, that was his solution. First, to undo the corrosion that Woods had put on the body, but most importantly, to extend the scope of an idea from the spirit to the flesh until the whole physical being became a suit of armor, forged from the metal of that concept. So we see here that he was not content with simply becoming physically stronger. He also wanted that strength to extend to the spirit, which points to two things. Once again, the rejection of mind-body dualism, this idea that you can have one that gets very strong by completely neglecting the other. That's not possible. The two grow together or they perish together. And it also points out to this idea that the corrosion he was speaking about was not limited to the body. Because essentially, if you have no physical existence, then your ability to utilize language to apprehend and explain, understand the world around you is also damaged. Because in a sense, you have eyes that don't see. So the idea behind physical development was more of a global effort to improve the entirety of the being as a whole, which makes him a pioneer of natural bodybuilding, because this is exactly what the practice is supposed to be as well. Sadly, many people have a materialistic approach to the sport, where they think it's only about having big muscles, but anyone who has actually spent a lot of time working on their body and on that natural bodybuilding journey knows that this is, again, a simply dualistic approach to a sport that is much more complex and much greater, because the spiritual benefits of natural bodybuilding far outweigh the material ones. I would gladly give up on all of my muscles if it meant keeping all of the things that I was able to build spiritually via the practice of lifting weights. The beautiful thing being that I will never have to do that because the two grew together. And I am fairly certain that the majority of people who stagnate in their physical development stagnate because their brain and their spirit has stopped growing, because they see the two vines as separate. Alas, these people are entirely wrong, and usually these are also the type of people who end up jumping on PEDs, because they have lost sight of what is important. They have lost sight of the fact that a strong and healthy body is usually the result of a strong and healthy mind. So they take a shortcut, and instead of developing that healthy and strong spirit, they take substances that create the illusion of size without having the thing that would motivate the size and would give meaning to the size in the first place. If we go back to the concept of beauty, I think that now you understand better why so many PD users look like total shit, where their goal was to trick nature and to hack nature so as to look superhuman, but instead they look non-human. They might be very impressive and very big, but they look nothing like what a healthy human male should look like, because they've taken a completely different path. The path of beauty is not their path anymore. They have taken the path of abomination. And I use abomination in the context of Dune. If you've watched Dune, an abomination is a being that goes against its nature. So in the context of Dune, for example, Aliyah is an abomination because she starts to welcome other existences within herself, so she's not a single mind anymore, she's multiple minds in one body, which is completely counter nature naturally and eventually turns her crazy. It's a different discussion, and if you're wondering, yes, I will eventually make a video about Dune. It's one of my favorite series of all time, but that's not the discussion that we're having here. The discussion here is the pursuit of self-improvement for the goal of developing both the mind and the body. And I know that sometimes it can be easy to lose sight of that spiritual aspect of lifting, but you have to try and be honest with yourself when it comes to the reason that pushed you towards lifting weights. And I think this is why so many people, again, really like this book, because it forces you to admit that most likely the reason why you started lifting wasn't only because you wanted a bigger body. What you really wanted was a better body. You wanted a body that best aligned with your ideals, your values. So a body in which your spirit could feel at home. And that is true natural bodybuilding. And that is exactly what Mishima attempted to do as well. This entire thing I discussed at the start with the language of the body. That's what I just explained to you. You have developed your own language of the body. Do not deny it. That language was present. You are not simply someone who is trying to get bigger muscles. There is something more to this entire game than just that, than just the material. The paradox of this realization of the connection between spirit and body is that you might have started with a weak mind and a weak body, but as you grew and as your body developed itself, the mind also built itself. And this throws us back to Mishima's quote, where it is the mind and the idea that the mind creates, this language of the body, that ends up being able to envelope the entire physical being, as if the concept of self-improvement was transferred from the brain to the body. And what is the process? What do we name that process of transference? Well, it's called training. It is the action of training that has this almost alchemical quality to it that transfers the image and the idea of the ideal body onto the physical existence of the body, which eventually becomes the image that you used to have in your head. If you took someone off the street and you told them about that, without telling them that you're talking about lifting, they would tell you that it's not possible, that we're talking about magic tricks. But there's nothing magical about it. Or, yes, there is. The magic of it is this special gift. It's this spark that we all have that allows us to undergo this transformation if we decide to. But the thing that Mishima doesn't point out, and that is the paradox I was referring to, is the fact that you might grow a very strong body and in return a very strong spirit starting from nothing, starting from scratch. You do not need to have a superhuman willpower to be able to build a body that reflects that willpower. And that's something that must be integrated, especially if you're new to lifting and you look at people like me or people who are advanced and you think there was something special in them and that something special eventually became apparent in their physical existence. You're wrong. That is not true at all. There was nothing special about us. The only thing special was that we made the decision to be special. So it's up to you to make that same decision. Become the shipwright. And as you build the ship, you improve your qualities as a builder of ships as you make a bigger ship. And this feeds into itself ad infinitum, which is what the perfected form of the language of the body and the language of the flesh would be. Eventually, the two would become intertwined. The two would just become extensions of one another. And that was what Mishima was talking about when he was talking about that armor. And I cannot resist. If you've read Dune, the third volume, I don't mean to spoil here, but pay attention to what happens to Leto when he has that armor around him. What is that armor? Is that armor really made of the organic beings? Is that why he becomes superhuman? No. It's an extension of his spirit. That is what the armor represents. But unlike the characters of Dune, our flesh has limitations, you could say. And I think that this is a perfectly valid criticism, because the alchemical reaction and the magical properties of the body I just described have their limits, absolutely. But that's not a bad thing. Just because this incredible power cannot allow you to grow wings and fly doesn't mean that it's suddenly irrelevant. If anything, Mishima believes that these limiting factors are actually important and vital, they're beneficial because they create the harmony and balance on which the body insists. And that throws us back to this idea of PD users. What happens when you take PEDs? You break your limits. You break your natural limits. And by natural limits, I mean the things that the body has put into place to prevent you from killing yourself or to prevent you from destroying the harmony and balance that your body is naturally capable of. So what ends up happening? You end up with a body that's all over the fucking place. Look at the amount of PD users who look like goblins. You couldn't pay me to look like them. Sure, they're huge, but there's something off about their physique. And it's something that I've noticed, especially the more advanced you become, the more your own body grows as a natural lifter, the less you find PD users' physiques appealing, because the more you see the flaw in them, and the more you start to realize that what you used to perceive as flaws in your natural body, namely these limitations, weren't actually flaws. You start to appreciate for what they are, which are safeguards that prevent you from fucking up and prevent you from not being able to pursue beauty. But it doesn't stop there. The work of Mishima doesn't only concern itself with the ideal form of the body and the ability to align the spirit and the physical existence so as to become an elevated being in a sense. It also asks questions of identity. Because if the action of walking on that spark separates you from your fellow man, it also allows you to differentiate yourself at a level that few people can understand. What I mean by this is that if you think of yourself, what exactly makes you different from other people? Is it the color of your eyes? Is it your height? At some point or the other, we're fairly similar to one another. And so anything that allows us to stand out should be celebrated and it should be regarded as a positive trait, especially if it takes effort, because now it's something that not just anyone can attain. So the chances of someone being exactly like you in your pursuit of your divinity and your godhood is almost 0%. And the more advanced you are on that path, the truer it becomes. Novices tend to form, and when I say novices, I mean in the realm of fitness, seem to form an amalgamation of flesh, and it's tough to differentiate between them because they themselves don't differentiate at all, because they don't quite know what they want yet. But those that survive this stage eventually become individuals. And the more you grow, the more your individuality grows. It's something that I've noticed with all advanced natural lifters. They're all extremely special. They're all quirky. They all have their own way. You never find two that are the exact same. And that's a good thing because this is the sign of a strong identity and it's the sign of a beautifully cultivated garden. Mishima uses the analogy and metaphor of the garden to describe the body that we build, the body that we work on, and that hosts the self. Since you spend your entire life in that garden, you better make sure that it's to your liking, aligned with your self-image, but also something that resembles nothing else. It is your own creation. Because in a society that is now super conformist, the ability to no longer doubt one's identity with others is, I would say, not just healthy, but it's a protection against pathology. I insist a lot on the notion of identity, not just because I think it's cool to be different, but because I think it is in your best interest so as to not succumb to the disease of our time, which is being like everyone else and thinking exactly like everyone else. So the antidote to that is the action of building the garden, of lifting, of developing yourself, because it forces two things upon you. It forces you into isolation, so now you're far away from people, you can no longer mimic your behavior after them, and also it requires patience. So you spend a lot of time in that isolation, time that allows you to build character. At some point or the other in your life as a man or as a woman, you will need to spend some time by yourself. You won't be able to avoid it. I personally believe that it's best to spend and invest that time when you're young because you don't have responsibilities yet. So in your teens is when you're supposed to do that work. Now, what is the percentage of people and humans who do that work in their teens? Maybe 2%? Why? Because when you're a teenager, you also have to deal with the opposite influx and instinct of wanting to be as social as possible because you don't want to be ostracized. So you're going to have a tendency to hang out with people, to mimic their behavior, and to, in a sense, create an attitude and personality that pleases them to make sure you stay in the group. And this is a death sentence for the self. Because once this very small time period of your life, teenagehood, ends, now you're by yourself, you don't know who you are because you try to be a people pleaser, and you have nothing to hang on to. And some people at this point realize, okay, it's time for me to actually find who I am, but many what they do is they just seek company. They don't want to be left alone with themselves because then they would have to face their own demons and who they truly are. And these people become sad individuals down the line, and worse than that, make horrible parents. Because if you don't have that identity, you will not be able to teach your kids how to get that identity. And you see that this reoccurring concept of the self that suffers from lack of action is recurrent in Mishima's work, where he explains to us at the very start with the pillar of white wood that emerges too late, that it's bad for a young boy to wait too long to discover his physicality. In the same vein, it's bad for everyone to wait too long to discover their identity. But thankfully, we have fitness as a remedy, right? Because your garden will be unique since you spend so much time by yourself cultivating it, and so the character that goes with it will also be. So there we are. This is the solution to this modern destruction of the self. Well, there's an issue with that, and it's that modernity has infiltrated fitness, and social media is a beautiful example. Look at the amount of young men nowadays who model their existence, their personality, what they like, the way they lift after a random person they found on Instagram, YouTube, or TikTok. So now we take something that was supposed to be a key to your identity, but instead of opening up the door for you to find yourself, you lock it, and then you walk into a room with a million people who are all looking up to the same person and trying to mirror their behavior. It's Clone Wars. That's what social media has become. So now, instead of worshipping their own godhood and working on that spark and becoming the person they were meant to be, which in reality means nothing, just like beauty or sacred, we give meaning to our own existence as humans. There's no such thing as the person that you were meant to be. That person is whoever you want to be. But that sure as shit won't happen if you're literally wasting your time worshipping the divinity of another man. Because think about it for a second. There is only two possible scenarios in this endeavor. Either you somehow succeed in becoming a clone, which is very unlikely, but now you're just someone else. That will never make you happy, it's not possible. Or you fail miserably because you're trying to mimic your existence after someone else's, and now you're left with nothing to show for it because you spent all of your energy and time trying to be something that you could never be. It's important to not misunderstand what Mishima tells us when he tells us that the experience of physical exertion is universal. Yes, the experience of the feeling is, but the action and the motivations aren't, and which is also what makes it so beautiful. It's the fact that we're all different, but we're all connected by that bond because we've all made that choice. To me, that is like the difference between a family or a group of friends and a cult. One is made of healthy, natural bonds that benefit everyone in them. The other one benefits no one but the cult leader. And the problem is that even if you wake up from the cult programming at some point, the damage is already done because, as I said previously, the longer you wait to cement your identity, the harder it will become down the line to build your garden. Up to a point where you won't even really want to enter that garden anymore because the amount of energy and work you're going to have to put in that you should have put in is going to overwhelm you entirely. As Mishima puts it, if myself was my dwelling, then my body resembled an orchid that surrounded it. I could either cultivate that orchid to its capacity or leave it for the weeds to run riot in. Now, if you've watched the entire video up to this point, I don't need to convince you of that fact, but just to be clear, you can choose not to garden, but you cannot choose not to have a garden. The two are different. You will be forced to face what Mishima describes as the weeds at some point. You will be forced to face all of that baggage that you left untouched because you were too busy socializing and you didn't want to spend the time on yourself. All of that won't magically disappear. It's always present in the unconscious, and the unconscious has a direct impact on the conscious life. And the worse it gets, the more in disarray the garden becomes, the more chaotic the unconscious is, the less tempted you're going to be to actually take a look at it, because the bigger the hydra is, the bigger the task is. It's the equivalent of someone who's hoarding in their house and who tells themselves that they'll clean up tomorrow, but every new day brings a new item in the house, and every new item is another reason not to actually clean the house. And if you've been following the Educated Barbarian Cycle, you know that this is a bit of a teaser for the Young arc that will come directly after Mishima. But essentially, in conclusion, for this particular part of the video, you must spend time on your garden, and even more importantly than spending time on it, creating a space where yourself is going to be comfortable in. Because if a chaotic garden, a garden full of weeds, is not going to be very welcoming and you won't want to spend time in it, one that is harmonious and is to your liking will create a virtuous cycle and circle where you'll want to spend more time on it because it is so relaxing, so beautiful, and so you will make it even better with time. That is the beauty of self-improvement. There is no end to it. The more you improve, the better you feel about yourself, the more you want to improve. On the negative part of that pendant, however, the more you deteriorate as a person, the less you want to actually look under the carpet, because the less you want to actually have to face what you've become. But when it comes to how to actually create this garden, via physical exertion, the body, sun and still, you're going to have to wait for episode 2 because, as I said, this was just an introduction. An introduction that, by the way, I thought was going to be 30 minutes long. As always, I have no ability to gauge how long these videos are going to be. But if you've been watching until this point, it must mean that I did a good job in explaining the concepts in this text. It's very important for me to get your feedback on that series for the simple reason that if the episode is not welcomed well or you guys don't give a fuck about Mishima, I will not do a part 2 and part 3. I'll just jump to Young to save some time. But if you like it, and if you actually want me to go deeper in the book, because this is like 25% of the book, and discuss topics again, such as physical development, the idea that Mishima had when it came to bodybuilding, his relationship with war, with patriotism, with Japan, with politics, all of that I would be very happy to do. I just want to make sure that you are actually interested. If you like these philosophical essays, keep in mind that you can support the channel on my Ko-fi page. It's the first link in the description. It is the supporters of this channel that make these videos possible. For me to be able to spend hours upon hours researching, filming the videos, editing, none of that would be possible if people weren't pledging monthly. So thank you for everyone who is giving their hard-earned money. And if you would like to also participate in the effort, you can do so by donating $3 a month. That is already a ton, and it makes a big, big difference. And that's going to be that for today. I'm going to see you again very soon. Thank you for watching. Have a good night.